afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Velandia, and welcome to a new episode of Voices of History, a segment in which we give the floor to national and international experts to delve into the key moments in our history, analyze their impact, and discover details that often go unnoticed. Today, we talk about the New Zealand troops who fight in the Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the handless battle of the World War II. We'll see what they face, how they fight, and the important role they play in this historic fight in Italy. And to guide us to this journey, we are honored to have a special guest. Now, we would like to begin by introducing the organizer of this segment, David de Caizal, a military historian, director of the Security and Defense Area at INISEC, director at the research group at the International Center for Advanced Research in Security and Defense at INISEC, and member in support of the Association of the United States Army, advisory member of the Military Law and Security Section of the Madrid Bar Association, and member of the INISEC Research Group and the University and Agency Partnership Program, a university project for the dissemination of the U.S. defense culture, and member of the Association of the Historian of Catalonia. So welcome, David, and you have the floor for start your presentation.
Muchas gracias, Laura, por la presentación. También dar las gracias a nuestro ponente de hoy, en Voces de la Historia, al profesor Jeff Plowman, por esta ponencia que nos dará sobre la participación de las tropas de Nueva Zelanda en la batalla de Monte Cassino en 1944. Para hacer una breve introducción histórica a lo que nos va a contar, bueno, recordemos que las tropas de Nueva Zelanda pues, van a desempeñar un papel muy importante y clave en la batalla de Monte Cassino en 1944. Una de las más duras de la campaña de Italia durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, integrada en el segundo cuerpo de ejército de Nueva Zelanda, comandado por el general Bernard Freybeck, que participaron principalmente en el segundo asalto y en la tercera batalla de febrero del 44. Recordemos que el segundo cuerpo de ejército de Nueva Zelanda estaba bajo el mando de Bernard Freybeck, que será sustituido al mando del cuerpo, ya que su división, la segunda, va a estar al mando del general Kippenberger. Luego que es herido por una mina en los combates, va a ser sustituido por el general Parkinson, con lo cual el general Freybeck va, digamos, a dirigir el mando de ese segundo cuerpo de ejército juntamente con la cuarta división de infantería india del general Tucker, que formarán este cuerpo de ejército aliado en Montecassino. La batalla como tal, librada entre enero y mayo del 44, fue una de las operaciones más sangrientas y estratégicamente muy importantes de la campaña aliada en Italia durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, también conocida la batalla como el Stalingrado de las montañas. Su objetivo principal era romper la línea Gustav, una poderosa línea defensiva y estratégica que bloqueaba el avance aliado hacia Roma, el punto principal y objetivo del quinto ejército norteamericano del general Clark. A pesar del apoyo aéreo y del bombardeo del monasterio de Montecassino, la ofensiva neozelandesa no logró romper las defensas alemanas y sufrió muchísimas bajas, unas 1.600 aproximadamente. En los posteriores asaltos, los neozelandeses van a continuar colaborando con fuerzas británicas, polacas e indias, contribuyendo finalmente al éxito aliado en mayo del 44, cuando toman la colina del castillo, toman el pueblo de Cassino y finalmente la abadía. Su participación demostró pues, un gran valor, aunque pues, con un alto coste humano. Freyberg y sus hombres recibieron la misión de tomar la ciudad de Cassino y abrir el camino a través del valle del río Liri para encabezar también la conexión con las fuerzas que provenían del desembarco de Anzio. Una antigua abadía benedictina, fundada por Benito de Nursia, que sospechaba, digamos, albergaba tropas alemanas, aunque luego, pues evidentemente se comprobó que estaba desocupada antes del bombardeo. Antes del ataque aliado del bombardeo que destruyó la propia abadía, no había tropas alemanas. Las tropas alemanas ocuparon la abadía posteriormente al bombardeo. La destrucción del monasterio no facilitó el avance, sino que lo empeoró. Los escombros crearon nuevas posiciones defensivas ideales para los paracaidistas alemanes de la primera división de Pfalzmeldjäger, que se atrincheraron en las ruinas no tan solo de la ciudad de Cassino, sino también de la propia abadía. Con lo cual, pues, eran auténticos expertos en combate en terreno difícil, con lo cual tenían la orografía y también la climatología, que era muy adversa en Italia en aquel terrorífico invierno, favorable a los alemanes. Las tropas neozelandesas, junto con unidades indias y británicas, luchan intensamente en la ciudad de Cassino, donde se desarrollan combates casa por casa en condiciones extremadamente muy duras. A pesar de su valentía y persistencia, los ataques fueron repelidos por las bien atrincheradas fuerzas alemanas y las bajas entre los neozelandeses fueron muy elevadas. Después de varias ofensivas fallidas, el segundo cuerpo de ejército neozelandés fue replegado para, digamos, poder reorganizarse. En los ataques finales de mayo del 44, otras fuerzas aliadas, principalmente tropas polacas, lograron finalmente tomar el monasterio y asegurar la población de Cassino. Sin embargo, la participación neozelandesa fue crucial en debilitar las defensas alemanas y sobre todo mantener la presión constante sobre la línea enemiga alemana. Y con ello, sin más dilación, te cedo la palabra para que podamos escuchar a nuestro ponente invitado de hoy. Gracias, Laura.
Muchas gracias, David. An excellent presentation of this episode segment on military history. Today we have a special guest to talk about the exciting episode. Jeffrey Plowman. He is a research biochemist by profession and military historian with over 35 years of experience. He has published 19 books and many articles in New Zealand armed units. Among his most recent works are War in the Balkans and Monte Cassino Armoured Forces in the Battle of the Gustav Line. So let's welcome Jeffrey. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Hello, it's Jeffrey Plowman here. I'm basically we're going to talk about the third battle of Monte Cassino. It's the second battle that Freyberg had led. He had essentially in the second battle he tried to follow similar follow this progress that follow the way that the Americans had led the battle in the first place, trying to attack over the mountain and capture the monastery itself and partly through the town. One of the things he'd learned that despite the experience of the mountain troops of the Indian division, that they were disappointed to him that terrain made it very difficult to operate, to deploy large forces, and to carry out simple limited attacks did not work either. They really needed combined attacks and just lacked the forces to do that. The Germans were also well placed to put down an inflated fire as attack progressed. They were able to fire from the monastery, from surrounding ridges, and at the same time, the plan actually involved essentially attacking through the monastery itself and then down onto Route 6. And then the Mara Battalion was supposed to attack with armor support, capture the railway station, and cut with them. And that also failed as well because the German defenders were very strong here. The Germans had also flooded the ground between sort of west of the the Repeater River. And so the main movement was just along that short railway embankment. This meant that the armor was limited. In fact, they couldn't get enough material through to the bridges and so on to allow the actual tanks to get support them. Ultimately, the American tanks overrun and had to pull out essentially. So when it came to the next battle, Freyberg had a quite different approach. He decided to attack north from Cassino down through to south towards the Liri Valley through a series of objectives. The second one was Jockey, which came out into the main Liri Valley itself. And it was going to use essentially the 6th Brigade as his infantry assault with the 5th Brigade in reserve. And he only had one other brigade of armor rather than the usual 3 brigades of infantry. It was limited him somewhat. Once he had achieved the Jockey, then he had under his command the American Combat Command B, and their job was to advance towards an objective called Libel. And once they'd achieved that, then his armor would take over. 18th Armoured Regiment would actually advance further south to Pignataro, and they would have support of 22nd Battalion on one of their companies, while the 20th Armoured Regiment would advance towards San Angelo and Tadici. And that would bring them in position where the 78th British Division was located. And the idea was to build 2 bridges, Salmon and Herring, cross the Guy River at that point. And they would join up with New Zealand Army and start a westward advance along the Liri Valley. At the same time as Combat Command B, also with New Zealand infantry support, would advance on the northern part of the Liri Valley. And there were a series of objectives: humbug, lover, artist, and so on. So that was quite a very bold move on his part. The actual attack itself was in the town, and he basically had to secure, our idea was to secure 2 phases: Quizzling, which ran along Route 6 as it ran through to the corner of the township of Cassino, included Castle Hill. And then the second one was Jockey, which was south of the Grabe River, essentially south of the railway station. This was being conducted with 6th Brigade and with the 19th Armoured Regiment providing armoured support. At the same time, his plan called for the Indian Division to essentially work side by side with this Indian Division along the actual lower hills of Cassino. Once the castle had been secured, there are other points like point 202 and point 236, and ultimately they were idea to take what was known as Hangman's Hill, which is where the old stanchion from the cableway to the monastery was still around. The problem after that, he says the monastery wasn't to be the main objective of the attack. It was only to be attacked after they had secured Jockey and they got Indian positions and the civilian position itself. And in addition, also, Seascarp and Armoured 25th Regiment was going to provide an armoured support for the Indians by working their way up the road to the monastery itself, and ultimately support the attack on the monastery too. The problem here was that General Mark Clark really objected to this plan. He didn't think it was a good idea. That he said the monastery should be actually part of the entire attack. So at this point, Freyberg modified his plans and set up specific objectives for the Indian Division to take. And with 1 brigade, essentially, the monastery, and there's a series of objectives here: Homer, Harris, Hadrian, Hercules, which was the Hangman's Hill, and Hector was the actual attack on the monastery itself. In doing so, he unfortunately essentially separated the 2 attacks. The Indians were no longer specifically working side by side, supporting New Zealanders in the South City town itself, and their objective was mainly focused on the monastery. On top of that, there was a new attack built in as well. Before the between the times of the actual 2nd and 3rd battle, the Indians been working on building a road up behind the monastery itself called Cavendish Road. The idea was to provide support for their troops in some of the higher points of the mountain. But the New Zealanders had the idea that we could actually expand it to take tanks as well, and take Sherman tanks. And so this planned revenge came into being, where the Indian Brigade, Indian Reconnaissance Squadron, and Company D of the 760 Attack Battalion would also appear. And once the Indians had taken the monastery, the tanks would come up behind without infantry support. Maybe with infantry support, there may not be infantry support. There were some Indian units in the area, and drive around towards Nassau and NATO. I think the idea was to divert the German attention from the fighting. And so this is Operation Revenge. This was the plan, but it had to happen after the monastery had been taken. So this is essentially the town. I just want to show the layout of some of the points in the town, key points. So for example, Rocky Little or Castle Hill on the top there, Hotel Excelsior, sometimes known as Hotel Continental. That's quite a key point as it turned out. The Chiesa de San Antonio, Botanical Gardens, which was basically a main square, and the Chiesa de Carmen, the convent. In terms of armor in the town, the Germans had 3 assault guns. Schumann had an assault gun near the Hotel Excelsior. Reiter had an assault gun in the school next to the Chiesa de San Antonio. And Tepp had another assault gun in what was known as the nunnery, another sort of convent and building further north in the town itself. Probably the most controversial part of the whole attack was the actual bombing of the town. Freyberg really had this belief. No one ever tried carpet bombing before, but really wanted to totally smash the actual town itself. And he had the view that if he could basically do that with a carpet bombing, he would essentially flatten all the buildings in the town, and he would turn the whole attack into essentially a typical infantry attack across open country. Partly this is because this is the New Zealand division had never actually been involved in street fighting in any war. They'd been involved in the desert, and when they came to Italy, they fought in Sonia, but never really got into street fighting in that part of the town. And they'd also seen later on the heavy fighting that the Canadians had, Altona itself, went up against the parachute division. And once again, we were fighting parachute division in the town. The view of the Air Force, however, was the fact that it would not happen. It'd be possible to get the tanks through the town within 2 days. And so Freiberg said he did not believe that. He was just wanted to go ahead with the bombing, essentially. Obviously, people like Mark Clark were against the whole idea, but he eventually got support from Alexander to carry out the attack. So the attack took place, started at 8:30 on the morning of the 15th of March. 8:30 p.m., 8:30 a.m. with medium bombers, 65 B-25s and B-26s. 8:45, the B-5 Forces and B-24 Liberator started their bombing. The bombing continued right through to midday. And after it ceased, the artillery and fighter bombers took over and carried on to allow just as the infantry closed up. And the whole idea of this point too was once the infantry attack started going, once the New Zealanders reoccupied the old positions, they would start lifting the artillery barrage. In a typical attack across open country, every 50 minutes they lift the bombings, the artillery barrage, basically. So in terms of armor in the German, they had a mixed success here. Gottfried Tapp in the nunnery, their assault gun survived, but damage to the engine, so it was not mobile. The gunner, the commander, and the gunner driver survived. The rest of the crew were killed. Back nice to Reiter and the Tuesday of the San Antonio complex, the assault gun was totally entombed in the building, and the crew disappeared. They were never seen again and never found, their bodies never found. On the other hand, Wachtmeister Schumann in the Hotel Excelsior complex, their gun survived perfectly okay, mobile, able to get out, full crew there. So, and this became quite a key part of the actual defense because the bombing had really missed out the area around the Hotel Excelsior, and a substantial number of paratroopers managed to assemble there and form quite a strong point. So this is the layout of the attack specifically. The main lines of attack were what were called Caruso Road, the road that ran up through the barracks to the village of Cairo, and parallel road next to it. You can see parallel road just along here. So essentially, B Squadron of the 19th Armoured Regiment was assigned to support the 25th and 26th Battalion. The 26th Battalion was going to come down parallel road and essentially on what would be the right-hand side, left-hand side of the New Zealand attack. And the 25th Battalion would come in down on the left-hand side with the job of actually taking also Castle Hill. So they had 2 troops of tanks each. 5th and 6th Troop were attacking with the 26th Battalion, 7th and 8th were attacking with 25th Battalion. And here's where the first problem came, because they had to cross the Rapido River, and they built a ford that's mostly dry, but there's some water in it. But the ford had been damaged, so the tanks coming down with 26th Battalion had to retrace their steps and then cross over, come along Caruso Road and join up that way. So the 26th Battalion managed to make the way through town. They managed to reach the jail initially and push on further, because the 5 and 6 troops were blocked by the ford. And once they actually got into Cassino itself, that was difficult. The rubble-strewn streets means it's very difficult for them to actually clear their way through. They had to get out of their tanks to clear the rubble. They eventually did join up with the 26th Battalion in the jail, allowed them to advance further on. 25th Battalion was supposed to help secure the nunnery. They managed to get within about, well, actually 7th Troop got through the jail. So yeah, they had difficulty getting through once again, and they were supposed to provide artillery support for the attack on Castle Hill itself. and only one tank was available to provide some fire support, but they did help them secure the nunnery at least one point. And later on, 24th Battalion sent one company, and they're basically a reserve battalion. So very little was achieved in terms of the tanks, and there's no further progress could be made through the town because of the bombing itself. In fact, the tanks that reached the jail and the 7th Troop, those 3 tanks remained in that position for the rest of the battle and until the liberation of the town on the 18th, where they had to replace the troops all the time. So this is essentially just a year-long cruiser road. In fact, the tanks now are actually C Squadron. These are infantry from the 25th Battalion coming through. And C Squadron was essentially there when they started bringing the first prisoners back. There are quite a few photographs of them, some of the paratroopers coming back. When it came to castle attack, it essentially had to happen by the infantry by themselves. There was absolutely no way that the tanks could support them apart from a limited amount of fire support. So what happened was 16th Platoon worked their way up the side of the hill, and instead of attacking the castle itself, they actually took a small blockhouse and house behind the castle, overran the troops there, and actually forced the troops in the castle to swing around and deal with this attack behind them. And that was a big advantage for the 17th and 18th Platoon, because they came up behind the troops in the castle and caught them completely by surprise, and very, very quickly overran the troops in the castle itself. And that would be probably the one major success of the day that allowed the Indians to actually take that move in there and take that position over. But this created a problem for Freyberg, because essentially his tanks had been blocked coming through the town from the north. So the only option then was to actually come in from the east itself along Route 6, their main viable route. And obviously they had to bridge Route 6 with bridges and stuff like that. So, and there were obviously also other impediments. The way Wilcox, for example, was a treadway bridge they put across a drainage ditch of some sort. And then they sent an A Squadron to try and provide support for the 26th Battalion, who were actually occupying an area just north of the actually what's known around here, which was the Botanical Gardens, and that's the convent itself. So Wilcox was negotiated. Then they found there were several more craters on the road itself, here and here. There was one crater which they could not negotiate with tanks, so they put a scissors bridge from a Ballantine bridge layer across here. The first time they laid the scissors bridge down, they had to relift it because it wasn't in position right. The second time, the first tank across, Lieutenant Stratton-Moran's tank, actually pushed the bridge into the ground, and they had to sort of lift it again and replace it for other tanks to cross over. And he was able to carry on further until he came to one more crater here, which completely blocked the road. He couldn't carry it on any further. So he did the thing of actually getting out of his tank and walking towards the convent to try and contact the troops that he thought were there, only to be, that was occupied by the Germans at that point. So luckily, some of the 26th Battalion troops in the village, the houses north of it, called him over and explained the situation. He went back to his tank, blasted the convent with artillery, with gunfire, and the 26th Battalion troops then were able to occupy the convent. So that was probably the first success of the 16th of March, and one of the only successes that day in terms of armour anyway. The next day, they decided to start pushing A Squadron into Cassino and allow other troops in as well. So 2 tanks got stuck in Hamilton Gardens. Peter Brown's tank threw a track on the Villa Arigny. He had to get support from the troop corporal, and ultimately more tanks came in. So this is essentially the situation here. So what we have here is the convent, the nunnery, the convent. So here's the Chief of the San Antonio complex. And there were 2 tanks that got stuck in the area around the Botanical Gardens itself. Peter Brown's tank got down here through a track, and then he suddenly found himself being attacked by paratroopers in the nearby buildings who climbed on the tank and started to try and get into it. So he called up his troop corporal, who proceeded to machine gun the paratroopers off the tank itself. but his two corporals through a track and then struck by anti-tank fire, which disabled it, but left the tank still able to be used for, they had to man it because it's still functional gun and everything else. So that wasn't a good start to the thing, but it did allow eventually some more tanks to get into the area around the convent. And what you can see here, about 3 or 4 tanks part around, including the quadrant commander itself. Now the objective really was to try and secure the railway station. I mean, we've partly secured Quisling, but only really half of Quisling. So the next thing to do was to actually send troops down. So they called up Jim Furness and his sergeant So Coleman, the other tank. The corpus tank got stuck in the thing. And they made their way down the road from the convent to the crossroads. And they could hardly see the road because of the bombing. So Furness actually got out his tank and walked down the tank in front of it till they got to crossroads. And they discovered some mines there. So he and Coleman set about clearing the mines from the actual crossroads. And that what they didn't realize was in the actual Hotel Excelsior complex was a PaK 40 75mm anti-tank gun, but they were short of ammunition. And so the commander had an answer call of nature. He'd locked the gun, so he didn't trust his crew to actually take it, any action while he was away. And so this crew had to sit there and watch while Coleman and Furness cleared the mines, got into their tanks, and then drove down to the railway station, which is down around this part here itself. And so they were quite successful in securing the railway station itself. And they were the only tanks there. There was no infantry, nothing else to support. The infantry had trouble getting across. In fact, the infantry up near the north of the Route 6 had difficulty crossing the road because of the quite heavy machine gun fire itself. So it took them a while to get across and start assembling and make their way down. So in the meantime, they decided to call up some more tanks. And this was now 2 troop under Lieutenant Beswick. And so he and Beswick and Ryder set off down the same route that Jim Furness had followed. Unfortunately, by this stage, the anti-tank gun crew, his commander had returned, and so they knocked out Beswick's tank, they knocked out Corporal Ryder's tank, only damaged them. The crew essentially escaped unhurt and managed to take shelter in the ditches nearby. In fact, I think Beswick's crew captured a paratrooper and took him prisoner and managed to get back to their lines as well. So so they had to try and get more tanks down. Corporal Hubbard's tank came along. By this stage, Schumann Stug 3 had decided to get involved in the actual fight here too. So he assumed that Ryder's tank was still mobile and opened fire on that and knocked it out, setting on fire. But the crew had led by that stage. But he also managed to hit Corporal Hubbard's tank. Hubbard's tank collided with Beswick's tank and basically slipped into a crater just off to the side, basically. It would be to the actual right of the road in the photograph, in the lower photograph here. Unfortunately, most of the crew were killed. The driver got out, but the actual gunner was still stuck inside the tank because the commander's hatch was underwater. And the problem with the Sherman was that they have basically a turret cage around the basket itself. It allows the driver to get out or get through the turret. But it was in such a position that this was blocked. And so the poor crewman was stuck in this tank most of the day and the night until they got to that night with, acetylene torches and got him out. I think it was basically a mess, and they sent him home to New Zealand. He was no longer sort of fit for fighting. But they also sent in more tanks itself. So essentially we've got Beswick's tank there, we've got Ryder's tank there, Hubbard's tank there. So Sergeant Milt and Lieutenant Griggs went in their tanks as well. Griggs' tank actually threw a track beside the building, which was the lower level of the cableway to the monastery. He swapped tanks with Sergeant Mill, but the tank was still capable of fighting actually. So essentially they were holding the whole area with the other tanks until the infantry arrived. And then with their fire support from the tanks, the infantry then moved forward and took what's called the roundhouse, the railway engine shed, and also they took the hummocks, the hills just beyond that actually. So by the end of the day, the New Zealanders had managed to secure half of Quisling, half of Jockey, but critically not the half they needed, because the main access route south was actually along Route 6 at the corner, Hotel Excelsior. And essentially the area south of the railway station, we're talking swampland and marshland, and not suitable tanks or any infantry to operate. So what now became was, it was a battle essentially for the southwestern corner of Cassino, essentially around the Hotel Excelsior itself. They brought the 24th Battalion along Route 6, and they occupied the convent and the Jesus San Antonio complex. And then on the 18th of March, now there's quite a lot of debate about this within the division. Freiberg was not happy about committing the 5th Brigade at this point. This was his strategic reserve. This is what he's going to use to exploit from the south. And yet there was a need for more infantry in the town, because even though they had taken key buildings, the paratroopers managed to reoccupy them at night time. And so there was a constant flexibility of battle. Even the Jesus San Antonio complex, for example, 24th Battalion occupied part of that, suddenly found themselves in a situation with paratroopers in a neighbouring building. The tank showed up in the middle of it and started to provide supplies. The Germans tried to knock it out with the Panzerschreck, and they were about to fire on them. And then the Mauer Battalion showed up. They brought the Mauer Battalion, so the 1st Battalion from the 5th Brigade from reserve, and they managed to actually clear their paratroopers out here. So they did then decide to launch an attack against Hotel Excelsior with tank support the next day. But once again, there was strong fire support from the Schumann's anti-tank gun, Stern Bishop 3. But at the same time, there's also a Panzer IV in town from the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, 115th Panzer Regiment. This tank came out and started engaging New Zealand armour. And there's a claim in the official history that New Zealanders knocked out the tank. In fact, what happened was, as far as we can make out, they disabled the tank, but the track damaged the track. So the crew covered it with smoke. You see the first of smoke coming on here. They were able to repair the track and get it out. What happened to the tank after that, no one really knows, but it was the only first tank versus tank action of the actual battle itself. So then the same thing, the 19th is also an important day, because Freiberg had been anxious to launch an attack on the monastery itself. The Indian division had been fighting against this idea. They said they hadn't cleared the town properly. They couldn't advance until New Zealand cleared the town. The New Zealanders would say the Indians couldn't advance without the Indians clearing the hills above, basically. There are points where they brought in the 24th Battalion to try to clear areas around behind the Hotel Excelsior, and that was a failure too. So, but so then the idea there was, but then at some point, things changed on the 18th, because the tanks had been parked up. The Indians had been parked in a place called Madras Circus up here, and the American Company D had been parked along the road beyond that. And in the early hours of the morning, they were saying things that the attack's not going to go ahead. Every day they were getting the reports, the attack's not going to go today. They haven't taken the monastery. And at some point it changed. And apparently the Germans and the German aircraft had spotted the line of American tanks on the road out under camouflage nets and strafed the line of camouflage nets, not showing what it was. And I think there was a concern that they had spotted the tanks, and the whole idea of this tank attack might be rumbled. So the thing changed very, very rapidly, and an attack that afternoon got organised. They said, we're going to put on this attack from the Indian positions on Hangman's Hill onto the monastery, and then the tanks were coming after that and put in their Operation Revenge. So the next morning, they started moving the American tanks into the Madras Circus where the Indian tanks were. They'd also brought in the 19th of the 20th Armoured Regiment Sea Squadron. Now, they originally been ordered to attack up the road to the monastery itself, but a reconnaissance on the 18th or so had shown very heavy damage to the road and would have made it impossible for the tanks. And besides, they hadn't taken the Hotel Excelsior corner, so they couldn't get the tanks onto the road anyway, the Hotel des Roses. So they decided to actually add Sea Squadron to that attack, and they worked their way up that night as well. So by the early hours of the morning, you had 3 squadrons of tanks essentially in Madras Circus, waiting to launch the attack. And just as the Indians were about to launch their major attack up towards the monastery and up from Castle Hill, the Germans decided to attack Castle Hill itself. And so a really bitter struggle occurred around Castle Hill that went on for several hours that morning. And so essentially they said, well, let's send the tanks in anyway, with this, nothing to lose by doing that. So they actually put in the tanks for that infantry. There was a possibility of a company of infantry being sent from some of the infantry in Indians further up, but that never actually happened itself. So they set off. It proved quite a surprise for the Germans on Point 593 and Snake's Head Ridge, but they also realized that there's no infantry support. They knew they actually had a good chance against them. In fact, they managed to get, at one stage, some of the New Zealand tanks got through as far as what they call Mas Avaneta, which is a small monastery on the hill beside it. One tank actually got up to the Mas Avaneta itself. The commander got killed. Another one ran into a ditch and had to be abandoned. But they came under fire. Two of the commanders were actually killed by sniper fire from the hills itself. And so that's as far as the New Zealand tanks managed to get. They eventually pulled back to a small saddle overlooking the whole area. And that they were waiting for further orders. In fact, there was actually an idea to pull them back to Madras Circus and call off the whole attack. But at some stage during the battle, they intercepted a German message to say that tanks had broken through towards the monastery. And so they decided, well, maybe we should try again and launch another attack and try and get through to them. So they decided to send the American tank squadron through this point, this American tank company. But by this time, it was getting towards the middle, and the Germans had actually been reinforcing the area around Mas Avaneta. They sent troops up with Panzerschrecks. And when the American tanks showed up, one of the paratroopers, a guy called Eckel, had managed to go ahead and lay some mines on the road to the monastery. And the lead tank, the one you can see in the photograph, ran onto those mines and was disabled. He went back to get more mines to disable the tank. And eventually, the crew managed to escape. They managed to get 2 crew off. The other 2 had to hide in the thing behind the tank. They were captured when it was destroyed. And the paratroopers then set about attacking the other tanks behind it. One got disabled by Panzerschreck, and the other 3 tanks got stuck in soft go and had to be abandoned. So eventually they had to pull back to Madras Circus. So the attack was a failure, but it was probably the most success they had in many ways in terms of getting further forward. But lacking infantry support, they just really couldn't do it. But also the infantry itself would have been exposed to fire from the paratroopers on top. So really what happened at this point was efforts in the town, focused on clearing the whole of Cassino, southwest corner around the town itself. So they really had to get that part of the town to get access to Route 6 to carry on the attack. And there were several more attacks made there. On the 21st, the main one was 21st Battalion launched an attack. And they managed to get a platoon out into the actual sort of ground between the New Zealand positions and the German positions. At that point, the Germans managed to bring up their assault gun and ultimately keep firing on the New Zealanders to keep their heads down. And eventually they captured the whole platoon itself. So that really was the last attempt by them to actually secure that corner itself. During the course of the time, they actually discovered Regis Stalk 3 in the elementary school, San Antonio Elementary School. The actual Maoris had discovered it a couple of days beforehand, and they'd found the crew, or they found somebody who was crewing the tank itself, and get them out. But they discovered on the 21st that the paratroopers were using this assault gun as a radio station to call down artillery or mortar fire on New Zealand positions. And they actually had a tunnel under the road to another position where they'd get away to. And they really brought up Jock McPhail's tank and locked the tank out and secured the position. McPhail's tank eventually slipped into a bomb crater nearby and had to be abandoned. So this really was what brought it to the end, armored operations in Cassino itself. The movement was really difficult to get around. Tanks that had got to the positions at the railway station or around the jail had to stay where they were. There were some tanks up near the convent, which they had to basically man. And by the 23rd, Freiburg's attack really came to a halt, and they had just settled into maintaining the town while they worked on the next phase of the attack itself. And just to illustrate some of the difficulties of moving tanks around in Cassino, this is a case of, this is the Treadway Bridge at Selby. No, sorry, the Treadway Bridge anyway. One of the tanks missed the bridge at night time and slipped off the road. Another occasion, they sent this British tank to retrieve a bridge, and they missed the road on the way back and tipped over into the crater itself. So it really was very, very difficult. In the end, they had to basically maintain the tanks around the convent, which you can see the distance, with the crews that went on each night, and had to maintain crews, swap crews around to the jail. Only at the railway station could they actually move tanks in and out, because at least the railway line had been cleared up with bridges and so on, and they actually closed up demolitions and so on. So to really look at operations in Cassino from the point of view of tanks, it was supposed to ease passage for infantry and armor, but in fact, it really was very, very difficult. The bombing had really closed off the northern part of the town for movement, which mainly forced the tanks to come in either along the railway station or Route 6 itself. But armor, when used, could be decisive for the defenders. The railway station attack is probably one of the key attacks where tanks actually took an objective by themselves without infantry support and held it long enough for infantry to come up to join up with them. And Schumann's Stug 3, the Hotel Excelsior, proved to be a key vehicle in the defense from the German point of view, and actually finding, destroying tanks on their way to the railway station and maintaining support for the troops in the town itself. The Cavendish Road attack was intentionally a brilliant move, but was never intended as a primary attack itself, and was compromised by lack of infantry itself. In fact, the Poles worked out eventually that really what needed to happen for the use of tanks along Cavendish Road was a combined attack with infantry attacking along Snake's Head Ridge above the monastery, along the other ridge, other side, so that you actually work here together in a three-pronged attack. In that way that you would actually divert German attacks from individual attacks itself. So that's the conclusion of my talk anyway. So you had questions, is that right?
Thank you very much for joining us at Voices of History. It is a real privilege for us to have you here to discuss this crucial episode of our military history. And if you agree, let's start with some question to put this important event into the context to develop deeper in its historical and strategic significance. So we start with the first question. David, ¿qué te parece si iniciamos con esa primera pregunta?
Sí, la primera pregunta para nuestro ponente de esta excelente intervención que ha hecho Jeff Plowman es sobre la participación de las tropas de Nueva Zelanda en la batalla de Monte Cassino. La primera dice así: ¿cuál fue el papel del comandante neozelandés Bernard Freyberg en la decisión de bombardear el monasterio?
Okay, the first question is about what role did New Zealand commander Bernard Freyberg play in the decision to bomb the monastery?
Freiburg was key in actually the decision to bomb the monastery and the township itself. He really was very insistent on both. He felt that he needed the town cleared, for example, and he also wanted the monastery bombed as well because there was always debate as to whether there were actually Germans in the monastery, but certainly Germans were very, very close to the monastery, and they were using it actually as observation points around it. And they're using the zone close to the monastery to actually, they took advantage of the fact that you couldn't attack the monastery itself with bombs or bombers because there was like a zone, but they moved within the zone of bombing that it's sort of to free them from bombing basically. So, but he insisted on it. He went over Mark Clark's head anyway to actually get permission to bomb both of those positions, the town and the monastery itself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer for the audience. Thank you very much. And we continue with a second question for the public. And seguimos con una siguiente pregunta para Jeffrey.
La siguiente dice así: ¿cómo afectó la participación de las tropas neozelandesas a las sucesivas batallas por Montecassino, teniendo en cuenta que formaban parte de un ataque aliado mucho más amplio?
Okay, the second question is about how did the participation of the New Zealand troops affect the successive battles for Monte Cassino, considering that they were part of the larger Allied attack?
Rather limited, I guess, in some ways. The town became a bypass to the town. Really, whoever controlled the Leary Valley either controlled the monastery hill itself or the hills on the other side of the valley. And the key to actually taking Leary Valley was taking one of those hills. And really, you needed to get troops across the Gari River further south around St. Angelo. So certainly we held the town or took part of the town, but we never took complete town actually. We never provided access that way. And what decided the whole battle and the fourth battle was really the French capturing the hills on the other side of the valley itself. And once the British got troops across the river and up the valley itself, then the town of Cassino became irrelevant, really, actually.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We continue with a third question. David, tenemos una tercera pregunta también para Jeffrey. Estás en mute.
Ahora, perdonad.
Ya, ahí ya.
La tercera dice lo siguiente: ¿cuáles fueron los principales objetivos de las fuerzas neozelandesas durante sus operaciones en Montecassino y la línea Gustav?
Okay, the next question is about what were the main objectives of the New Zealand forces during their operation of Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line?
The main objective was still to get into the Leary Valley, and the objective of the first attack was to try and isolate Cassino Monastery, take the monastery, open up Route 6. And so once you just get the railway station, taking the monastery, then troops will be able to enter the Lehigh Valley along Route 6 from south of Cassino. The second attack that Freiberg was involved in, the idea there was to actually clear the Gari River as far as St. Angelo to allow bridges to be put across the river to then get 78th Division and the Americans to advance up the valley itself. The monastery was symbolically important, but I think what really Freiberg wanted to do was to actually open up the valley from the Cassino township by driving south as well the river.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We continue with a final question or continue with our segment. David, ¿te parece si continuamos con una última pregunta?
La última dice así, ¿cómo influyó el terreno montañoso de Monte Cassino en la estrategia y las tácticas empleadas por los soldados de Nueva Zelanda?
The last question is about how did the mountainous terrain of the Monte Cassino influence the strategy and tactics employed by the New Zealand soldiers?
The monastery was always an influence in the sense that it overlooked the whole valley. The observation from the thing basically gave them a clear view of activities below. So regardless of whether you could operate without or not, you're always aware that there was somebody above looking at you, essentially. And it I guess, was psychological from the point of view of soldiers of the town. You could bring a lot of fire down on the town all the time, actually, itself, any way up that mountain. And there was a classic case, for example, of some infantry had captured some German soldiers, but they couldn't get them back to their own lines because of machine gun fire, and they needed tank support to come up and take care of that. And they were constantly watched by that. When they actually got the tanks into town and they went to the phase of no longer fighting, they're just maintaining the ground, they could not move the tanks anywhere. They couldn't move the periscopes, they couldn't move the turrets or guns, because the Germans would know that someone was in those tanks itself. There was the little things like periscopes being moved was a key to actually keeping them, the guys safe in the tanks itself, actually, and any movement itself as well. You couldn't move around at night because there's people on the hills could see you all the time. It really limited movement and operations in the town.
Thank you. Thank you very much. An excellent answer too. Sir Jeffrey Plowman and Professor David de Caizal, thank you once again for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It has been a real honor to journey with you through this significant episode in history. New Zealand troops in the Battle of Monte Cassino. To everyone who joined us, thank you for you being here and being a part of this new segment and new episode of Voices of History. We remind you can visit our website to learn more upcoming events, conference, and new installment of this international interview series. We'll see you again very soon and in the next episode of Voices of History. Thank you very much and see you in the next international episode.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.